All right, welcome to our June 1848 housing webinar. This one's on new communications plans for house corporations. I'm Thomas Lovejoy, the Director of Graduate Involvement. We've got Steve Bocher, the President of 1848 Housing, who's going to be doing this presentation. Just wanted to give one quick set of directions to all of our attendees before we get going. You can raise your hand and I can kind of answer your question, or if you also have questions, you can type in the chat. So there's a question section and a chat section. It's a lot easier to type in the chat section. So do that. I'll keep an eye on that kind of throughout the whole thing. If you want to just write a question down, and then I will ask Steve that or answer myself. So without further ado, Steve Bocher, here you go.
Great. Well, good evening, brothers. I'm so glad to be here with you today as we talk about new communications plan for house corporations. If we jump to the next slide, you'll see, and I think you'll recognize that the role of house corporations really have grown and changed than as they were 10, 20, even 30 years ago. The good old days, right, where we just wrote a few checks. We might show up at the house every month or two, do a quick walk around occasionally, solve a problem. Those I guess we could call those the good old days. But now we're in a new environment. We're in an environment that we have to adopt a new method. If you'll advance the slide there, Thomas, where we recognize that our role has got to be first and foremost focused on safety. Second, that it's focused on member experience, things like cleanliness and food service, and third, that we're fulfilling our fiduciary obligations as corporation directors, and that we're planning for the future. And we've actually talked about a number of these in some prior webinars, and I would encourage you to look through our webinar library on the figam.org site. And the topic that we're going to focus on today is our new role and responsibility of having more and better communications with our shareholders. Now, you might be asking yourself, why is new communications, a new communication strategy important? Well, there's a number of reasons. First and foremost, right, we're a brotherhood, and it's good for Phi Gamma Delta. It's good for not for college days alone. But it's going to help us as an organization, as a house corporation, and as a fraternity by having great communication with our graduate brothers. We're going to maintain the enthusiasm for the fraternity. As you know, there's brothers that graduate and don't really have much more to do with Phi Gamma Delta after graduation, and part of that is we have to keep them engaged, and communication is part of that process, that engagement process. The other part, of course, is that it's this good communication is going to help us recruit new board members, chapter advisors, Purple Legionnaires, other key graduate positions within Phi Gamma Delta. Now, the next thing that we have to understand is communications is part of our fiduciary responsibility. As a house corporation, when we think of a typical corporation, right, a corporation board is accountable to its shareholders. And as a house corporation, you're similarly accountable to your shareholders. And your shareholders are the graduate brothers of that chapter. They're the ones that you're representing and holding the asset, the chapter house, in trust on behalf of your shareholders. And so, just like a corporation a for-profit corporation is responsible to communicate and share timely information with their shareholders, we believe that same model is appropriate for house corporations. And as you'll see through the time of our webinar, there's certainly really good reasons why that makes sense. And then, the other aspect here is that, as we talked about, this isn't the good old days. Running a house has gotten to be a bigger job, a more complex job than it was 30 years ago. So it's essential to our overall success that we have participation and engagement by more brothers than we have had in past. Now, the simple truth is that good communication is also central to successful fundraising. And Thomas, yeah, there you go. And so we know from experts like our preferred partner at Columns Fundraising that you need multiple years of good, solid communications prior to major fundraising campaigns to be successful. And so we can't just be flat-footed, need to do a campaign, and then all of a sudden start pouring out communication. It just doesn't work. And the truth of the matter is, we're as much in the fundraising business as we are in the house maintenance and food service programs in our role as a house corporation, as a role in our role as a house corporation board member. Fundraising is a reality that we're all facing, and so communication is an essential element to that. Now, the why of a good communications plan includes a couple different areas. One, we're here to share information. We want to be transparent. We want to be upfront. We don't want to be surprising brothers with news, and we want to keep them engaged not just when we need money from them, but we want to engage them in the periods in between, so that when we do come to a campaign point, whether it's a major campaign or a smaller campaign, that they felt like they've been a part of our team along the way. So, in a general sense, as we look at kind of this from a 1,000-foot level, we need to and we want to utilize our partnership with the chapter whenever possible. So if we can piggyback with the chapter's communication efforts, if they're sending out a newsletter and we can send out information along with that certainly makes sense, and it's an appropriate collaboration. But we need to make sure that we're not dependent on the chapter for communication, because the truth is some of our chapters are very good at communicating with graduate brothers and some not so much. And so we can't rely on them to do this work, but if it's possible to collaborate with them and do it together, that certainly is something that we want to encourage. But we also need to make sure that we understand that our communication goals are a little bit different than the undergraduate chapters. And that's important. We can't rely just on them providing content, because the content the chapter is going to want to share is going to be different than the content we're going to want to share. And so we'll talk about that in a couple of minutes, but I want to make that point. So the who of our strategy, we just got done talking about the why. Why is communications important? The who is, as I alluded to, is the shareholders. That's our audience, the people we represent as we serve as officers of our house corporation, and that's, of course, the graduate members of the chapter. And so that's our who. And so as we communicate, we want to be sensitive to sharing information that's relevant to them. Does that hopefully make sense to you? So now let's go and talk about the how. The how of our communication strategy is going to be multifaceted. It's important that we have a good quantity of touches with our graduate brothers, and we're recommending 5 to 7 distinct communications with graduate brothers. We want that communication to be varied, but mostly with print and electronic communications. And we'll talk a little bit about why that's important and appropriate in a couple of minutes. But you'll notice that we're going to supplement that, those email and print communications, with social media activity as well. And of course, we want to have in-person events included in that. So let's take a look at the first area, in-person events. We want house corporations to engage the shareholders, our graduate brother members, at least once a year. And of course, the ideal time to do that would be tying it with the chapter's pig dinner. And my guess is many of you have already concluded that that's a smart way to do it, and are taking some time before the start of the pig dinner to have a formal house corporation meeting. For those of you that aren't doing that, we definitely want to encourage you to do that. And Thomas is a great resource. He can provide you with some insights, and we have some resources that we'll be talking about at the end of this session on the FIGAM website, and have some possible sample agendas and things like that you can use for that annual meeting. In addition, though, to the pig dinner, we hope that you'll be able to tie in some graduate events with some other chapter activities throughout the year. Because again, remember, our goal is engaging brothers, getting them building enthusiasm for their continued involvement in Phi Gamma Delta, not just from a fundraising standpoint, but from a brotherhood standpoint. So using chapter events and supporting the chapter's efforts to get graduate participation in things like homecoming or Founders Day or a holiday party, or just coming to the chapter house for a meal, or going to a sporting event, either at the college or at a professional team event in your city. Those would be good examples, easy examples of ways that we can get graduates involved and engaged with each other. So that's our in-person event strategy. Now, in terms of the communications, we want to acknowledge that there's multiple ways to communicate, right? Traditional mail, printed communication, so that could be postcards or a newsletter, common other ways, phone, email, a website, and social media. Those are some of the common ways that we currently use to communicate. And what we want to explain to you is that there's not one of these that's right or wrong, but the fact is there's no single method that is going to be effective with everyone. And so the message we want to plant, and we'll go to the next slide, is that using one method of communication is really poor communication. Because if we just use social media, we're going to miss brothers. And if we just do emails, we're going to miss brothers for the simple reason that we don't have every brother's email address. And email addresses change frequently. So there's no one method in that list that's perfect. And that's why, you noticed in our ideal strategy here, we're using a mix of email, print, and then also some social media channels. So it's really important that we understand this. If we go to the next slide, the next piece of this is just recognizing that there's pros and cons of every method of communication. And you may be sitting there saying, gosh, we use email and that works really well. And that's great. We're not saying to stop doing any one method that you're currently using, but to just recognize that each of these has limitations. Let's just talk about social media for a second, right? The limitation of social media, depending on frequency that you check it, is that your posting could be 80 or 100 posts down by the time somebody checks their social media account. If you post something at 8 in the morning and I don't check my social media, my Facebook or my Instagram feed till 10 o'clock at night, I may not scroll down far enough to see your post. So not to say again that social media is bad, but it has limitations. So phone calls, very effective, but very time consuming. And so it's a great way to get engagement. In fact, it's one of the few ways that gives us instant feedback, right? Because it's two-way communication. Hey, brother, I'd like to invite you to the ball game, and you get feedback right then about whether they like that idea or not, whether they can come or not. And we don't get that from a newsletter communication or a social media post in many cases. So again, there's pros and cons of all these methods, and that's why we're encouraging you to use a mix of these. So in the next slide, let's talk a little bit about the kinds of things that we want to be communicating. Remember, I talked about how our agenda for communication is going to be a little different than the chapters. You know from experience that the chapter is going to be talking about their GPA, and they're going to be talking about rush, and they're going to be talking about their success on the intramural field, and they'll be talking about officers and maybe a few undergraduates, spotlighting them. And that's great content for them to share. What you see here, though, is we're concentrating on how to engage brothers that are both newly graduated and also have perhaps graduated for 10, 20, 30, sometimes 40 or 50 years later. And while I would suggest that the success of the intramural football team is important to maybe a brother that graduated more recently, it's probably less interesting and less important to somebody that graduated 10 or 20 years ago. So the kind of content that we're looking for is to provide news about other graduate brothers, spotlight graduate brothers from different generations, maybe different decades, and be able to highlight or feature some information, from those different decades to make sure that it's of interest to all the people reading or all the people we're communicating with. Maybe sharing some career news with each other. Of course, we want some college news. What's happening on campus? What's the new buildings, that are going up? What's changed on campus? And of course, chapter news is important. And so we can either, again, if our communication is a written communication and it's going out with the chapter newsletter, then they'll take care of that. If it's not, if we're doing it separately, then we'll want to get some chapter news from the chapter to include in our communication with the graduates. And then we're going to want to include information about the house, upcoming plans for renovations, upcoming improvements or recent improvements that have been made. And then we're going to want to promote those events that we talked about, the in-person events that you have planned, things, whether it's an upcoming holiday party or a sporting event or activity, or reminding them about the pig dinner. And then recap the events and talk about how many brothers attended, and share some feedback from the people attending. It was, great to see so many, brothers and little testimonials, if you will. So those are the things that we want to encourage you to include in your communication strategy, and we think that this is the right recipe to engage graduate brothers. Now, if we look at the next slide, the thing we have to remember is who our audience is. So if you're coming from a mature chapter, if your chapter's 50 years or older, you're going to have a communication with people ranging from 21 to potentially 80. And so you need to think about that as you're developing your content and your range of information. If your focus on graduates is only the graduates that graduated in the last 10 years, you're not going to provide much of interest to that graduate that's graduated 20 or 30 or 40 years ago. So we have a broad span. If you're from a more mature chapter, you're going to have a wider age range, and that's going to influence your mix of communication, how much of it is done electronically versus a written form, and that's going to be a factor. If you're from a younger chapter, if you're from a newer, newly chartered chapter, then in the short term, you're going to have just a younger group of graduates, and you'll want to adjust your strategy slightly for that. But the important thing is that we want you to see how the graduate communications is different from the chapter communication. And hopefully we've been able to demonstrate and highlight the differences and the importance of that. Okay, so let's jump to the next slide and just remind you, in terms from a planning standpoint, that an effective communication strategy is not haphazard, and it requires a plan. So we want you to think about what it is that you want to do, calendar it out, and then execute it so that it's not just a hit and miss. I didn't remember to do something, and all of a sudden you're trying to hustle something out. So we have on the FIGAM website, with that link, a sample plan, and the next slide is a cut and paste from there. And this is not designed to be cookie cutter for you, but to just give you an idea of kind of the strategy or a simple plan that you can use to kind of sketch out what you want to communicate and when you want to communicate it. So in here, we're focusing on kind of a January newsletter, then in March, maybe a note or a postcard or a letter with a pig dinner invitation, and then May or June, an electronic newsletter with end-of-year information, a follow-up on the pig dinner, maybe some updates on the chapter house. And then as we're coming into the new school year, July, August, another e-newsletter, followed by a physical newsletter, and then perhaps a December holiday end-of-year kind of message. And again, the specifics of what we're including aren't really important. It's really just to give you kind of the idea that we're hoping that you'll have a plan and you'll figure out what it is you want to communicate, the method that you're going to want to communicate, and then, of course, you're going to supplement these things with your Facebook and Instagram other kind of social media posts. So hopefully that makes sense to you guys. So the next thing we want to do is just take a second and review some of the resources that are available through Phi Gamma Delta. And so I'm going to turn it over to Thomas to talk about some of those things.
Yeah, so we've kind of recently revamped our graduate communication services. It's now available on the housing portion of the website. So when you'll find it there, kind of right in the middle of the housing portion of the website. But this is the gist of it. So I'm not, Steve may be better well versed of pricing of these things, but all I know is that we can offer comparable, if not better, prices to do physical letters, postcards, or emails. And the thing that's important is that we have the database of a large majority of our living brothers' email addresses and addresses. So if you guys want to send out an email that is a pig dinner reminder with maybe some end of year spring tips or whatever you want to do in that area, we have that database of emails and we can send it for you. We have all the formatting, the HTML coding, all that stuff in our communication department. We also have templates for letters, for postcards. You guys can see them online. You can download them online and edit them yourself. You can give them back to us, and then our services team will use our database. Or if you have your own mailing list, we can use that as well to send out postcards, letters, anything you need. It's kind of mainly geared towards pig dinner stuff, but like we're saying, the most important house corporations for fundraising, for everything, are communicating 5 to 7 times a year. So we're hoping 3, 4 physical letters, and if you need our assistance at headquarters, we can offer those services for you. So, Steve, if there's anything else you want me to add, I can. But that's kind of the main gist of what we're offering.
Yeah, that's great, Thomas. I appreciate you going through that. So, brothers, really, there's two aspects to this that we want to share. First is we know that this is a big ask, that you're working hard to do, just the basics of running the house corporation and running the house well and keeping it safe and providing good services to the brothers. And we understand that and we appreciate it and we respect that. What we're also trying to share in hopefully have made a case for you is that in this new world that we live in, communication is also got to be added to our list of responsibilities as a house corporation. And what we hopefully again have made a strong case for is that in order to take care of business on the basics of keeping the house up, communication is woven into that responsibility. Again, if for no other reason that our fundraising efforts aren't going to be as successful as they could be if we're only contacting people when we want money from them. And you can appreciate that. That would be a pretty frustrating experience as a graduate if the only time I heard from my brothers is when they had their hands out. And so that's certainly not our philosophy. That's not our not for college days alone philosophy. And it's just not an effective way to do things. And so this new norm, if we want to call it that, speaks to the fact that communications is really, really important. And so what Thomas has shared is that what we're trying to do with the graduate communication services and the templates and some of the resources is to try to take some of the reinvent the wheel part of this out of the process for you. And so the starting point that we've got going so far is our House Corporation newsletter and editable template. We're going to be adding to this over time and should have some e-newsletter templates for you. Maybe we'll have a one-page version of the House Corporation newsletter that we can get a template going for, and we'll grow this over time. And the idea is, if you don't have a local printer, if you don't have somebody that has the time or the experience to do e-blasts, that through headquarters and the graduate, specifically the communication services part of headquarters, that they can shoulder some of that load for you and do it at a competitive price. So that's really the key, I think, to this, that we recognize that this is important, and we recognize that it's really essential, and we're also now trying to make some resources available to make it easy for you to execute. So with that, let's jump to the last slide. And Thomas, I had a couple polling questions, but I kind of decided maybe we would just table those and maybe see if we get any questions from any participants in the webinar, and kind of go that route.
Yeah, so if you guys have any questions, you can type in the chat box, or since it's kind of a free Q&A right now, if you know how to unmute yourself, you can go ahead and just jump in and ask a question, and we'll do what we can. And we'll give you a couple minutes now to kind of think of those, and hopefully you guys got some. And then while we're waiting for some people to think of questions, Steve, I just wanted to add to one thing that we were talking about in the last slide with the graduate communication services. So we don't necessarily have templates up for like postcards or for emails like that. But if you guys have ever gotten a House Corporation newsletter or just an email in general from headquarters, it's going to look, the email that you send out with our program is going to look a lot like that. Where it's going to be the purple columns with the logos, but we can change the logos to your own. We can change the text to whatever you'd like. So the emails are going to look like that. And for the postcards, it's going to be pretty much any postcard sized piece of paper that with any pictures and text you want on it. So that's the simplest one to do, is the postcard.
Brothers, one of the other things, if you want to share what your House Corporation has been doing for communications and how you feel like that's been successful or has opportunities, that could be also a good discussion topic in this section of the webinar. So if that's something you'd be willing to share with the others on the webinar, we'd love to hear what you've been doing and how well it's been working for you.
Yep. And Steve, we just got one question in. It's thoughts on how communications might flow differently given a trimester calendar with 10-week terms and breaks.
Sure. That's a great question, and I actually went to a trimester school or quarter system school, and so definitely, the idea here again with that sample communication strategy was really just to start giving you some basic ideas, and so I think modifying that, for the different move in, move out schedules is going to be definitely appropriate and necessary, but I don't know that it necessarily requires a whole separate calendar, just a different kind of timing for some of those same messages.
All right,
Thomas,
yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
We got one more question there. It says, for 3 printed newsletters and several e-blasts for approximately 1,200 mailable addresses, what's a ballpark estimate annually? So that's something I don't have a lot of experience in. But if Steve, if you do, just give the very general number, and usually our services can meet it or beat it.
Yeah. I think that's a great question. Part of that's going to depend on whether you do a 1-page or a 4-page, or I should say a 2-page or a 4-page newsletter. So the template that we have on the phygam.org site under the graduate tab is a 4-page newsletter, and I think probably budgeting a little bit over $1 a newsletter printed and mailed maybe something in the the dollar 20 kind of price range would probably be pretty reasonable. So this is going to be as you mentioned with 1,200 graduates, you're talking probably a $1,200 to $1,500 per mailing cost to do that. So 3 times a year, 4,500 is some a reasonably significant amount of money. But what I want to encourage you as you think about that, and before you say, oh my gosh, we got we don't have an extra $5,000 to spend on this, is what's the ROI of doing that? The ROI is when you're going to raise $500,000 or multiple millions of dollars for a major renovation, being able to have a success rate that is multiple times higher because you've had ongoing consistent communications with your graduate, your shareholder pool. And again, I've heard this from columns. I've heard this from, in fact, all 3 of the major fundraising organizations. If they've said it once, they've said it, a dozen times in different presentations I've heard, that the biggest obstacle that they face when they're getting ready to do campaigns is that the House Corporation hasn't had regular, consistent communications prior to starting the campaign, and people see the lack of the lack of I can't think of the word that I need. The fact that all of a sudden the communication is coming for money as opposed to being first and foremost about engaging them as a brother, and then being able to broach the topic when it comes time to raise capital, to throw that in the mix versus coming out of the woodwork and having your hand out. It just makes a huge difference. So I want to, hopefully the brother that was asking that isn't feeling like that amount of money is prohibitive. I think if you think about investing that amount of money, $5,000 a year for 3 newsletters, and think about the ROI in 10 or 15 years, I think we would make the case that you'll get a huge return on that investment when it comes time for your next capital campaign.
Yep, and we just got a comment from Dave Schreck. He says, I've used the email blast 5 times this year to communicate with all the Kansas State Fijis, and at a moderate cost of $25 per mailing.
Yep, and that's absolutely right. And Dave, good to have you on the call. I've had a number of conversations with Dave this year, and he's doing a fantastic job, by the way, with his House Corporation. And I, the thing I would throw in there is, absolutely remember earlier in the presentation we talked about pros and cons of the different forms of communication, and email absolutely is great for a lot of reasons. And low cost is one of them. That Dave's probably using something like MailChimp or Constant Contact or one of the many email services out there, and you can do that at a relatively low cost. The thing to remember again is, depending on the age of your chapter, are those older brothers, do we have their emails anymore? Do we have their correct email? And while it's tough to predict, it's not necessarily that perhaps some of the older brothers might be some of the bigger donors, because I don't know that that's necessarily always a hard and fast rule. But we, again, just need to be sensitive to realize that at some point, email is not is not going to work perfectly for everybody. There's some of us, that are on the call that all we're doing is slogging through hundreds of emails a day at work, and so when we get home, we're either quickly going through our personal emails or we're doing it late at night, and that may not be the best time to engage somebody. Right, in the late hours of the night, and so again, we can't control when they open that email. So we run the risk of being kind of in a delete mode that we've all gone to when we've are in a rush going through emails. So again, not to say email is bad. That's part of our plan, but we also want to make sure that you're using some other methods to supplement it.
And looks like that's all the questions we got. Just one last comment on this before we end it, if we don't get any other questions. The IHQ database is actually more accurate for physical mailing addresses because we get the postal service to update it for us. Whereas with emails, we rely on you guys giving us your new emails if you get one, and that kind of, and response rates from the emails that we use. So email is great, but also in our database, it might be more accurate to send, obviously more expensive, but might be more accurate to send physical letters as well.
Perfect. Brothers, before we wrap up, and I'll let Thomas do the formal close, I just want to also just remind you, please be sure that you're jumping on to the phygam.org site, that you're taking a look under the graduate tab at the housing resources. The 1848 Housing is working hard to continue to add resources. We have some of our preferred vendors on there, which right now includes Columns Fundraising and Upper Crust Food Service. But we also are continually updating and adding different resources to help you be more effective in your efforts to be excellent in operating your house corporation. So as an example, in the last month or two, we've updated the safety checklist. And so we now have a really very comprehensive checklist. We've collaborated with our insurance partner and also used a variety of other resources to really make it a very comprehensive process. And as you know, and I'm preaching to the choir, safety is our number one objective. And so tools like that are available to you. We have a recently added resource on evaluating the assets of the chapter or the house corporation, and so we have a tool there that can help you schedule the replacement of those assets and anticipate the future costs of replacement of those assets. So we encourage you to be going to the graduate tab and under housing and looking at those things, and we'll be adding some more things here through the summer. So we appreciate everything you're doing, the work that you're putting in, and know that we appreciate that effort, and we know that it takes a significant amount of time, and that you're doing that for the love of your chapter and the love of the fraternity in the future, and we're really appreciative of that. So thank you for your service.
All righty, thanks Steve for doing thanks Steve for doing the presentation tonight. Thanks everyone else for joining. This will be posted online on that graduate housing tab, just as Steve was talking about. That'll be on there by the end of the week. So if you guys want to rewatch it or share this with someone else, go for it. But other than that, you guys have a good night. Thanks for joining.